What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back to yet another episode of 5 Questions with Levi the Return, episode 14, and yes, it's on the makeup day of Friday, because I forgot to record yesterday, or the day before for that matter, but I'm back. Episode 14 is here, and a reminder to those who want to ask me a question for next week's episode, episode 15, be sure to send one question per user in the comments section below, and I will do my best to answer it on the next video next week. But without further ado, let's answer these questions. Question number 1 comes from BlazeLife334. Favorite metalcore / deathcore band? Well, I am not really a fan of deathcore really at all. Out of all the metal styles out there, deathcore is by far my least favorite. Not to say that it's a terrible subgenre of metal, it's just most of the bands in it are just not very good or suck. But I do have a few bands that I do like in deathcore, and my favorite of them all is probably Despised Icon, because they were one of the first that created it and did it right. It was more honest collision between death metal and metalcore rather than just about chugging slam breakdowns and just knuckle dragging tough guy stuff that a lot of deathcore bands tend to follow. And also they incorporate a little bit of technical death metal elements into their music. After all, they're from Montreal, where you got Gorguts and Cryptopsy and Cathelist and a bunch of bands that are just super hyper technical death metal. And they combine it with their love of New York hardcore. Carnifex is another band I like, considering they bring in a little bit of a symphonic black metal influence into deathcore. And then you get a band like Thy Art Is Murder that brings in a lot more traditional death metal or even blackened death metal elements. And then a band like The Red Chord that brings in some technicality and grindcore influence into deathcore music. But my favorite out of the deathcore bands is Despised Icon. Now, metalcore I like a lot more than deathcore, even though it tends to get a bad rep, and now the word metalcore is dirty, to the point where a lot of music journalists want to classify bands like Code Orange and so on as quote-unquote metallic hardcore, when really, it's metalcore, guys. Just call it metalcore. That's what it is. Whether people like it or not, it's metalcore. And I think the reason why people want to remove themselves from metalcore is because metalcore has gone into two different paths. The first one being the more traditional metalcore bands, where it's bands that honestly want to collide elements of hardcore punk with extreme metal, not into the vein of a genre like grindcore by any stretch of the means, but in their own way, like a heavier version of hardcore punk, but it's metal hardcore, not punk hardcore. And then you get the melodic metalcore bands, where they mix in the influence of melodic death metal and metalcore together, and some bands do it well, others not so much. My favorite metalcore band overall, however, is Hatebreed, and they followed the traditional metalcore style, where it's metal hardcore, not punk hardcore. You know, they're brutal, they're fast, they're chuggy, they're aggressive, they're I think I said brutal, but they're vicious. And I just have always been a big fan of the band. So, favorite metalcore band, Hatebreed. Favorite deathcore band, Despised Icon. Question number 2 comes from Mr. Death Metal. Favorite Cannibal Corpse album from the Barnes era? Well, I thought all of the Barnes era albums were perfect albums. I know a lot of people don't like Eden Back to Life because it was more death thrash. I like it for that reason, because I love me some thrash, and why not combine it into death metal? But then, of course, you had the following 3 albums helped kind of pioneer the brutal death metal subgenre, along with bands like Suffocation and Broken Hope and Cryptopsy. But my favorite album of the Barnes era, hands down, The Bleeding, and it's also my favorite Cannibal Corpse album in general. Not because it was the last album with Barnes, it just was ironic that that was the case. No, it's because the music on it was just so well written. You got a perfect balance between groove and technicality in the musicianship. Like, there's some technical parts, but there's some catchy parts, but they still sound brutal. They still sound death metal. And it's also one of the best death metal productions of all time. while the album cover sucked, but the music itself certainly did not. So easily my favorite Barnes era Cannibal album is The Bleeding. Question number 3 comes from Keith Miller Jr. Favorite hobby as a kid? Oh, geez. I would probably say buying wrestling action figures all the fucking time. Like, I used to have, like, a fucking tote full of wrestling figures. Like, you could name me anybody I pretty much would have had. Like, Hogan, and Cena, and Orton, and Batista, and Triple H, JBL, and so on and so forth. Like, I had a lot of them back in the day. I wish I still had some of that for, like, decoration, like, on the shelf over there, just to show off my love of wrestling that I still have. But, yeah, favorite hobby as a kid, getting wrestling action figures all the fucking time. It's like I almost think to myself, now that I'm older and wiser, yeah, maybe my parents shouldn't have relented as much as they did back then, but, hey, when you're a kid, you can pretty much get whatever you want somehow. But yeah, that's the way it was in my household back then. So yeah, buying figures of wrestlers. Question 4 from Space Metal Ferrari 248. Aside from Onslaught, Sodom, Creator, Sepultura, etc., what are some of the best non-American thrash metal bands in your opinion? Well, you pretty much named all of them right there. I mean, those are all the best non-American thrash bands. But others that should be given respect, Destruction from Germany, part of that German Big Four. Same with Tankard. Tankard's a good band. Exhumer, probably the most underrated German thrash band. Especially their last 2 albums that have come out. They were amazing thrash albums. So yeah, those are 2. Hostile Defiance and The Raging Tides by Exhumer. Perfect thrash albums of the modern age. Other non-American thrash bands, Mutilator from Brazil, especially that first album, Immortal Force, which I plan on getting at some point. That's a great album, and an underrated band that unfortunately didn't make it out of the 80s and broke up by the early 90s. So that's tough because they were a really good band. Sabbath from England is a great band. Those first 2 albums, I forget what the first one was called, and then the second one, Dreamweaver. You want to talk blackened prog thrash? That's the one for you. Annihilator from Canada is a great one. Razor also from Canada. Even though they border on speed metal, they're pretty thrashy. Let's see, other non-American thrash metal bands that were great. Mortal Sin from Australia. They were kind of like the Australian Metallica. Like, they wrote their style of thrash kind of influenced by 80s Metallica. That's really all I can think of off the top of my head right now of, like, thrash bands not from America that were great. Oh! Early Pestilence, like the first Pestilence album, Malleus Maleficarum, that's a thrash album before they became death metal juggernauts by Consuming Impulse in 89. But 88's Malleus Maleficarum, that's a great thrash album. Yeah, that's really all I can think of off the top of my head for non-American thrash bands, because really those 4 right there, Onslaught, Sodom, Creator, and Sepultura, are the best out of the non-American scene. But yeah, all the bands I brought up, I would say, are some great examples of non-American thrash. And finally, question 5 from Dimebag Daryl, and it's about time he asks a Pantera question. What is my favorite and least favorite songs from these 3 Pantera albums? Cowboys from Hell, Vulgar Display of Power, and Reinventing the Steel. Ooh. I'm gonna go ahead and say Reinventing the Steel is the one post-80s Pantera album I am the least familiar with. I've never really listened to that album, and I don't really know why. I know people say it's a good enough album, I just have never got into it. But as far as Vulgar, my favorite song from Vulgar Display of Power, I'm gonna go with This Love. Some people say Walk. I love Walk, don't get me wrong. But I like This Love because of the different moods it puts you in, and also Phil's guttural scream towards the end of the song. I really, really like that. As far as least favorite, I mean, Vulgar's a classic album, so I guess the song I've listened to the least off of Vulgar, I would say, would be something like Demons Be Driven or A New Level. Those two songs. Now, Cowboys from Hell, that's harder because that's my favorite Pantera album. And to me, shut up, Duck. And to me, still the best Pantera album. Favorite song from Cowboys? I gotta give it to the title track just because it just comes at you out of nowhere. The riffs, the solos, the vocals. Now, as far as like least favorite song from Cowboys, even though I love the album top to bottom, but the song I've listened to the least off of Cowboys, I would say Message in Blood. That'd be like the one oddity on that album that I've listened to the least. It's still a really good song, but it's just doesn't hold up to the rest of the tracks of the album, in my opinion, that is. But anyways, thank you guys so much for asking me questions. I will be back next week for episode 15 to answer more. But until next time, horns high, and I will see you soon. But for today's episode of the Mosh Pit Reviews, probably right now the biggest album to come out in 2019, and it's from the pioneers of death metal, arguably the pioneers of death metal, Possessed, and their first album in 33 years entitled Revelations of Oblivion. But the point I'm making with the respect Jeff should get, he goes out, tours the world, playing festivals, singing while in a wheelchair, where pop stars, if they get sick, theirs was canceled. Jeff goes up in a wheelchair and performs just as hard, if not harder, than any other metal frontman out there. So, total respect for Jeff Becerra. I'd love to see them make another album in the future and see where they go next.